Working?
Yep,
Great.
seems to be.
Finally.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, could you remove your phone from the? I think you've joined with your phone as well, right?
No, no, no.
Because there are two Pranavs who are logged in.
I joined from Chrome, which I've closed.
Okay, for some reason. Okay, never mind then. Never mind. That's fine. I think I can.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I think I can. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. So, um, wait. Yeah. There you go. So how's it going?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. Having a lazy weekend.
Great. You do you want to tell me about the board exams and the stuff?
Oh, um, well, I mean, honestly, as a teacher, I think board exams are probably the well, it's not nice to say, but it's probably the most relaxed time for me. Because most of my students are on study break. Um, so my work is restricted to just corrections and giving feedback and all of that. So
And and
uh,
and how does
yeah, this is actually uh, sorry.
and what does that look like? Like when you're correcting copies and like what does that? What do those sessions look like?
Well, I mean, it's very straightforward, especially because I mostly teach Cambridge. Uh, it's read and answer, point out the sort of errors and explanation that is being made. I guess the biggest weakness I've seen is a lack of emphasis on uh, process or explaining how processes unfold. So essentially, I think students generally struggle to explain how something moves from stage A to B to C. Uh, so a lot of the feedback sort of revolves around that, and of course, making sure you're addressing what the question needs.
Hmm. So I am sort of having the flashback of this one thing that you sent me about how we observe colors, right? How do we know? How do you know that if what you're observing
Huh?
is yellow is the same as what I'm observing is yellow?
Yeah,
We've called them to
yeah,
know that okay, this is we can look at a color together and we can say okay, we're gonna name this color yellow. But how do I know if the yellow in my
yeah,
mind looks the same as the yellow in your mind? And so the thing,
yeah,
yeah, so the thing that just popped up in my head since you said that, okay, we've got, you know, they don't, they're not very clear about how things proceed from, phase A to B to C and so forth. Would you say that, I mean, for me personally, I've never had teachers who have entertained any questions of that sort in a classroom. So for me personally, like one that I would project onto the real world is the fact that okay, because people don't actually emphasize children's or students' own critical thinking skills, they never reach to that point of actually wanting to figure out okay, how does faith, because to want to know how stage A goes to stage B and stage B goes to stage C, that requires a lot of critical thinking skills. So you can't, for me personally,
yeah.
yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of students want to know why it happens. I just think it's an essential prerequisite to being able to uh, write a good answer or meaningfully discuss any kind of question. So it's something I try to sort of emphasize. A lot of students do prefer maybe rote memorization or just remembering structures in which you can write answers and sort of plug and play. Uh, so it's not the case that a lot of students do want to learn it this way. I think there is um, a large emphasis on functional outcomes. So, for instance, at the end of the day, you're writing a board exam. So, how can I sort of maximize my efficiency in terms of the effort I put into something and the output I receive? Uh, so, a lot of students don't want to necessarily learn the processes behind, you know, something moving from stage A to B to C. Uh, but I think that remains the best way to sort of understand something because things are not static, right? Things generally don't, uh, as much as we might try, they don't really fit um, clear categories.
Okay. So,
So yeah, so I do think emphasis on process um, sort of helps students, at least those who do dedicate themselves to learning this way, at least the subjects I teach, which are sociology and economics. Uh, I think they tend to sort of it tends to be a very sustainable way of learning.
okay. Okay. So, hmm. What do you think is the reason for the same, that they're not interested in asking those kinds of questions? According to your perspective, according to what you've seen through your interactions with them, or if you've had like a personal chat with a few of them and you're like, okay, like, are you guys interested in this or are you not? And like, what's the reason if you are or aren't?
I mean, again, I think a lot of this just boils down to acting with a certain degree of intentionality, right? Uh, I think most of us, uh, or arguably, 99.9% of us, never really, um, whether we enjoyed school or not, didn't really think about why we were going to school,
Mm-hmm.
or didn't really understand why we were doing the things we were doing in school. And I think that question sort of persists in that, um, if I'm teaching my students about demand and supply, sure, they can maybe understand how price works. But for a lot of them, they don't want to become economists or work in a field that's adjacent to economics. So they don't really understand why they're doing it. Uh, and I think as a tendency, curiosity tends to be, or curiosity regarding certain subjects tends to sort of be distributed um, among certain students, right? So no student, or it's very unlikely that any student is equally interested in all subjects.
Sure.
Uh, and as students sort of move to higher and higher grades, the only reason they study becomes to sort of get into university, and university again is sort of a credential that you need. So I think from that point of view, uh, well, if I had to sort of condense what I was saying, I would say uh, there's a general lack of, I guess, um, practice in a lot of teaching, which is to say, if I wanted to learn about color or if I wanted to learn about plants, um, I might I might interact with them at most in the lab environment, but I don't really get to see a plant grow, or I mean that's maybe not the best example. Um, but yeah, so I guess there's a high degree of abstraction that takes place, which sort of removes you from the grounded aspects of whatever you're studying, which can alienate you from what you're studying and why you're studying it. Um, and I also think that there is a great emphasis on the functional or the output aspect of it, which is you need to get good grades, you need to sort of go to a good university. Those credentials are essential. So I think you sort of optimize for those outcomes over, say, learning, which can take a longer time.
So, in that case, would you then say or agree that um, focusing too much on the output is actually killing kids' dreams to be an economist. Maybe they wanted to be economists all along, but or maybe they don't even know what they want to be, but they actually want to study. But too much emphasis on the output and the, as you put it, like grades. Would you not say then that that's what's causing people to lose their passion for any given subject?
I wouldn't say it's you know that's the sole cause, or even that's the fundamental cause.
Okay.
There could be many causes in that. There I've also noticed a general reduction in overall curiosity.
Okay.
So this could also be due to broader, like all of us becoming more consumption oriented over sort of wanting to create our own things, whether it's in the form of writing, art, or even working on any kind of problem that interests you.
Yes.
So I think there has been a general reduction in that. Now I also um, wonder if historically as well this has existed or not. uh, I am skeptical to some extent that this is a unique phenomenon we're facing. Uh, in that I don't think for most of history everyone has been brimming with curiosity, and you could maybe reduce that to material conditions. Um, but I also think there is an inherent impetus that sort of drives people towards wanting certain answers. Um, so yeah, I think that is a big factor. I do appreciate. So, for instance, when I started teaching, I was against the whole concept of exams. I didn't see the utility of an exam, but I have started to see sort of the necessity of some form of assessment. Whether a written exam is the best form of assessment is a separate question, but um, given a lot of constraints, such as needing to check for cheating and so on, and that's a separate question entirely. I think cheating also arises because you optimize for sort of grades. But I do think exams are an essential component of the learning sort of cycle. Uh, I think the emphasis needs to move away from exams in terms of the importance that is given to them, but at the same time, I don't think as a part of a learning cycle, it's something that should go away. It can change. I think it should change, but I think it needs to stay. Some kind of assessment.
Okay. What do you think is the why do you say that it needs to stay? That some form of assessment needs to stay? Like, what is the premise of that sort of? Um,
I mean,
yeah.
I guess it's a very broad-based sort of definition of the word assessment, but uh, like you mentioned in terms of the examples of colors, assuming that the way you and I see colors is the same, my assessment of whether you understand the word green would be to ask you to point to an object that is green.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um, I don't mean write exam on what is green. I just mean, let's see, can you show me what green is?
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting point. That thank you for bringing that up. So let's say let's since we've already brought this color analogy and
Yeah,
example, I think let's just stick with that. So let's say you've got two students in your class, like 5 years old, right? And first grade. So you're teaching first grade in this
yeah.
hypothetical, and they when they
Hmm.
roll into your class, they have no idea what colors are. They don't know. They've seen colors, but they don't know what the word green means or what the word blue means or so on and so forth, right? And your job as a teacher is to, for the purpose of this particular example, is to educate them on which color is yellow or which color is green and so on and so forth, right? And so the assessment that referencing the assessment that you called out just just a few moments ago, which is that, okay, you know, you need to check or assess whether they've got the colors right, right? And let's say that they're unable to, um, you know, name the colors the way that you taught them, right? And these are children who don't have any sort of color blindness that we might need to factor in for. So let's just take out any anomalies, right? So there are two kids. One of them is able to, parrot out the colors as you expect them to, and the other one isn't. Like he's maybe interchanging the two. He's calling green as yellow and yellow as green. What would you think is the problem? Like, would you think there is a problem, or would you just say, okay, this kid is inadequate?
Well, no, I guess. I mean, I guess this just boils down to how we understand language as a whole, right?
Yeah.
Because when I draw or when I say the word chair, there is sort of there is an interaction happening between the concept of a chair and the actual chair that I might be looking at, right? So if a child is consistently calling a chair a table, and by the way, I should caveat this by saying I teach older grades, and I think teaching younger children is a very different sort of ballgame, which I've not been exposed to very much. I think the youngest I've taught have been sixth, seventh graders. So just a caveat as to say that maybe what I'm saying is experientially flawed or maybe even incorrect. But in terms of how this has worked with older children, I would say it's just a mistake in terms of the categories you assign to specific objects that you're seeing, right? Uh, so I think it's just a matter of repetition and repeated application, which is to say, um, I might show the child the two colors they're getting wrong, so yellow and green side by side, and I would ask them, point to me once again. What is yellow? What is green? Presumably they point opposite colors, and I say just flip it. You know, what you're calling yellow is green,
Yeah.
and what you're calling green
Yeah.
is yellow. So it's just sort of fixing that. It's a linguistic misunderstanding. I wouldn't call them stupid for it. It's again, if they repeatedly make this error, then there is, you know, you got to figure out why they're not understanding language properly,
Yeah.
or why they're unable to apply
Yeah.
their understanding categories cleanly. But if it's not something they grasp instantly or intuitively, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, so then wouldn't you say that, well, this is something that I'm saying, not asking that if you'd say it or not. I'm asserting that that's exactly
Yeah.
when I think the education system is failing, because they see a student's test mark and they're like, okay, the entirety of mistake is yours, and there's this thing called fundamental attribution error in sociology, if you've heard of it. So it's like that, right? That all the mistakes,
Yeah.
you're sort of pinning it on the child, on the student, and you're excusing the environment completely, as to maybe the child has grown up in an area where everyone calls green as yellow and yellow as green, and you're saying, oh, no, 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 it's the child's fault. There's something wrong with the child, and you keep arguing with the child that, no, 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 this is, what you're saying is it's the other way around. Yellow is green and green is yellow, and but the child keeps insisting, no, 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 but everyone in my town says that this is the case. So, and I think, but a lot of the times children don't have that kind of a vocabulary to be able to say, no, but like, this is what I've learned in, throughout my upbringing, because they don't know, like they don't, I don't think they necessarily possess that kind of verbal self-awareness that they can verbalize. And I think that's why tests like fail, because they're not able to test anything. They're only able to test if the child can conform with what you've taught, not necessarily if the child has learned what you've taught. Does that make sense? Like the
Yeah, I think yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, just sort of let me address different parts of what you said. In terms of what you said about maybe me being in admissions committee at a hypothetical university, not admitting a child because of poor grades, and maybe the child got poor grades because in their context, um, yellow and green in our example is flipped. Uh, so I think that speaks to a problem in terms of centralization of knowledge
yeah,
in general. In that um, there is a lack of pluralism in methods, in terms of also the kinds of things that we're looking in different contexts, right? So I think methodologically, this is quite evident in that we tend to want one method that works and that works across varied contexts. But the problem is that becomes a one size fits all sort of solution.
yeah, yes,
And any method sort of becomes static
yeah,
on its own. So a method sort of, a concept can exist outside of time,
yeah,
so to speak. But when the concept needs to become actuality, it ingresses itself into a dynamic process. So static methods, which sort of flow from the top to the bottom, face this problem where you're not able to sort of um, adapt to different sorts of problems that you might face in different contexts.
yeah. So it's not correct.
So I think there's a lack of methodological pluralism.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's not self-correcting. Like you said, you said a very interesting line that the designation flows from top to bottom instead of correcting itself from bottom to top, right?
Yeah,
So it's not self-correcting in that.
I think I lost you.
Oh, okay. Uh, is
Yeah. It's no. I got you.
yeah,
Yeah, it's yeah. There is a lack of self correction, and I think even self correction is a degree of abstraction, right? Because uh, in any mechanism or any system of knowledge gathering or knowledge acquisition, we are the ones collecting this knowledge. So I think there needs to be an emphasis on the ways in which we collect this knowledge, and I think there needs to be also an acknowledgement for the fact that different methods work at different sort of at addressing different kinds of problems. So I think the issue that you mentioned about a certain localized context where they call yellow green and green yellow probably prioritizes different things or just looks at the world sort of differently, and applying your categories onto them sort of a causes this communication mismatch, but it also deprives you of two sort of constructive ways of looking at the world. And again,
yes,
I'm not arguing that yellow and green are you know these big concepts that you need to discuss, but I'm saying broadly it's a symptom of different ways of looking at the world, and both ways can sort of show you different aspects of the world that you might not be um, aware of.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So since you said that, you know, one of the things that I really okay, before I move on to that point, I'd just like to, narrate this beautiful quote that I had just seen it's been a few months, but I revisited it a few days ago. There's the following. All bureaucracies do this insofar as they set demands they insist are reasonable, and then on discovering that they are not reasonable, since a significant number of people will always be unable to perform as expected, they conclude that the problem is not with the demands themselves, but with the individual inadequacy of each particular human being who fails to live up to them. So it sort of gives you a sort of systemic criticism of the top to bottom designation thing that's going on with most systems that are bureaucratic in nature. So that was the first thing. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was that when you've got these systems which ignore differences in perspective. And even if you look at the education system, it's all about, when you enter into a classroom, it's never about students asking most of the questions and the teacher answering most of their queries. It's usually the other way around, right? Even, like the teacher will tell them to either read a chapter and then they'll ask questions. They'll do like a trivia pop quiz or something of that sort. And even in even exercises in the textbooks, is the textbook is asking you most of the question and you just have to fill out the answers. The exams are the same way. The exam asks you tons of questions and you have to answer them. And that's assuming that there's only one perspective to it, right? And obviously there is something known as the truth, the objective truth. But the problem is that the process is sidestepping the process of discovering the truth. It's not letting people discover the truth. It's just saying that, okay, this is the truth and you have to accept it no matter what you think. So I think that's like a really big problem.
Yeah. Well, on the I'll address both your points. On the first, I think you need to be a little wary, or I think we need to be a little wary in terms of attributing a lot of individual failure to systemic failure. In that, yes, systems are flawed, very flawed, and systems do collapse or do fail at various points. But I don't think the entire blame lies on the system, because again, you can have varying degrees of agency, and you can also argue that agency is materially rooted in that um, I require, say, security of food, shelter, and so on to be able to act in an agentic way. But I think the problem with structuralism, or viewing human outcomes as structural outcomes, is that it denies, or it minimizes human agency. And I think there is a degree of personal responsibility um, that is involved. Could you remind me what you said? The second thing you said again?
The second thing was, denial of the process of discovery of truth, like just
Right.
force feeding facts into people's throats without actually
Yeah.
giving that curiosity a chance to discover the truth for them.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things here. The first, again, is how interested are your students in finding out the truth, or this process of finding out the truth? And I think this is something that could be cultivated from a younger age, but I also think there are certain uh, other influences. So, for instance, if I'm admitting a child into a school, I might want to then think about, does the child's parents prioritize um, questions about the nature of truth, or basically, do their parents want their child to be curious, right? Because the parents do play a very big role.
Yeah.
And if the parents' objective is, nay, I just want my child to sort of score well, check these boxes, then it's unlikely that the child themselves, even if they have some sort of curiosity, is able to or willing to express that curiosity. So I think bringing that out becomes an important aspect, but then you need to know where your child is coming from. So yes, the first question is: are you interested in finding the truth? Is that something that draws out a sense of wonder in you? And I think, again, this is mutually constituted, right? So it is the teacher's job to bring this sense of wonder out, but to a certain extent, the child needs to be receptive to what's happening. For that sense of wonder to you know blossom within themselves as well. Uh, so I think that is an issue. I think there's also a lack of intentionality with a lot of choices that people make. So again, and in an Indian context, this is
Could I just
looking at a very, very
like a point of clarification? is that you said the child needs to be receptive to the wonder element. So what should the child be receptive to exactly?
Well, essentially, if from a very young age I have not been conditioned, I do think that curiosity and wonder, to a certain extent, are inherent to children.
Yeah,
Children, and again, what they are curious about or what they're wondrous about need not be universal.
absolutely.
So different children might be interested or curious about different things. But I think there is a sort of impetus or appetite for learning about the world around them.
Oh,
Um, and from then, it becomes a question of sort of, and again, the context in which I am talking is grades 9 to 12. So by then, there's already a ton of conditioning
exactly.
that has sort of happened.
Exactly.
But when you look at it from a very young child's point of view, I think how encouraged they are to ask questions, how their questions are responded to. And again, I'm not even talking about necessarily the content, right? You might not know the answers to the questions they're asking, but do you enthusiastically respond to them? Is it something that you're happy to talk about? Um, or is it something that feels like a burden to you, so on and so forth? I think those sort of influence the attitude that you bring or that a child growing up brings to questions that they have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So I just like to I just
so, for instance, at least in my own, yeah,
Yeah, so I'd just like to bring in another point, and this is, relating back to your first argument, which was that we can't blame it on the system, with from a structuralism lens, because then it takes away personal agency of human beings. And so I'm connecting what you just said with that point, and here's my full argument, integrating both those things, is that you can't actually say that children who have not developed even a sense of themselves, a sense of who they are, to be acting with personal agency, right? And that's my point, is that in that case, you have to blame the system, because the system might not be limited to just the school. It could be the society around it. It's basically the entire environment, including the parents, including the neighbors, including every single person that the child interacts with, everyone in the school, the watchman, the person, the bus.
at which point,
Yeah. So I'll just complete my argument, which is that
no, I guess I agree with that, because at that point,
yeah. So my
but
full
at
argument.
that point, I would say you can't call it a systemic failure. Call it. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, continue.
That's fine. That's fine. Don't worry. I think there's a delay, so I'll just complete my argument. The argument is this: because children have not developed a sense of personal agency till they're, maybe at least 16 years old, or at least 15 years old, and even then, like, we call them adult when they turn 18, right? And I think that's when they do have a more rigid sense of personal agency, or a sense of responsibility. And people develop them to various extents, but that's how we standardize them. But so, following on that, my argument being that we can't blame the kids. It has to be the people around them that we need to blame, or that we need to hold responsible and accountable.
Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. So I guess, but at that point, I wouldn't call it a systemic failure necessarily, purely because I think the word system allows you to abstract that problem away. I would call it a series of personal failures, right? So it then I think the focus becomes, okay, which which aspects of my environment failed me, and I think, yes, I agree that you can't blame children at that age. And I think the reason that they are treated or called children is because they don't have, to a certain extent, the capacity. Um, and I think, or I mean, purely because they're unable to forecast outcomes, right? I don't think it's because of any inherent um, inability in a child. I think it's just that the worldview or the context of the world that I have when I'm 12 or when I'm 13 or when I'm 14 or even when I'm 16, 17 is quite limited. Um, and of course, there are exceptions to this. I'm not saying that this is, a universal truth, but generally there is an inability to forecast beyond your immediate circumstances, and I think that is what makes them children and unable to sort of um, uh, make sound decisions. Um, so yeah, I think I agree with what you said there. I just disagree with calling it a systemic failure, because I think that tends to abstract the problem into, let's fix this by certain policies and modifications to how things work, which I think could be useful. Um, but the first step needs to be inculcating these senses of personal responsibility in parents and teachers, uh, in people who work at schools. And generally, I think the problem broadly becomes intentionality when you look at many of the problems that we face, right? Because a lot of us are operating off of presets.
Yes.
Uh, um, and there are always, even people who have sort of become aware of these presets may not always be aware of these presets at the point at which they're acting on them, right? So uh, if I might understand, abstractly, that something makes me angry or upset when I'm in a calm state, and I can reason while I'm calm, I can reason to myself that, oh yes, this is not something that I should be upset about. But at the point at which you're angry, or at the point at which you're upset, your anger is the most rational sort of thing that you feel, right? So I think there's just a very small example, but I think there's a lack of intentionality from parents, in that parents don't know what they want out of their children, so they send their children to school, to college, um, and so on, and have sort of a life planned out for them. And I think that is useful, in that I think a certain structure is always useful. I think chaos without any kind of order can be overwhelming and scary. So I'm not saying structure is bad, but I'm saying you're not intentionally choosing what structure you want. And then you inevitably have problems with the kind of structure you've chosen for yourself, because you didn't enter that equation intentionally. And I think institutions also become dead, because the people who are within those institutions, maybe when an institution is being made, it's very live, it's very dynamic, because things are changing all the time. But after a while, people within institutions become cogs. So again, you don't have these nodes of your system operating with any degree of intentionality. So I think um, that also becomes sort of a very big problem.
So okay, so let me answer a bunch of things. Well, respond to a bunch of things. So firstly, I think it is a systems failure, and I'll give you my argument for that, which is the following: that once you say that okay, it's the job of the parents to be able to figure out what they want for their children, I think right there you're saying that okay, parents don't know what they want for their children, which means that nobody told them what they want for their children. So it's somebody's fault, right? Maybe it's the parents' fault. Maybe they had a child without actually knowing why they were having a child in the first place. So like that definitely parents have, like, they need to be held accountable. There is like no question about that. And so the first line of sort of accountability and responsibility, I think, lies on the um, parent side of the court, because they're the ones who are giving birth to this child, right? And in that very real sense, the entire accountability and responsibility for how the child grows up to develop their own independent personality, in to a great extent, lies on the side of the parents. Granted that, having said that, there's this saying that it takes a village to raise a child, right? And it's not like the world is dead set against people having children. There are like lots of policies, at least in most nations, that okay, no, we incentivize the institution of marriage, we incentivize the institution of a family, we incentivize you to have kids. And I feel like that is something that's very deeply fundamental in most societies, that we want you to have kids. but when but they're not necessarily giving parents or the students themselves the tools to develop the kind of personal agency, to develop the kind of sense of ownership that will allow them to take matters into their own hands when needs to be taken into their own hands, right? So in that very real sense, I think it might not be the system's fault that you see at the first sort of glance, that okay, you can't blame the school for this. Okay, sure, granted, but then you have to blame someone, and it can't be. And I've already placed the blame on the parents, so you know parents already have a part of the blame, but the rest of the blame goes to society, right? Because they're not, as I said, reiterating what I said before, is that they're not giving us the tools to be able to build a functional society, a psychologically healthy society. Like, they want us to propagate society by having children and raising them, but they're not necessarily giving us the tools to be able to do that in a functionally and psychologically healthy manner. The second thing that I do want to talk about is the following. When it comes to agency, right? You can't say that okay, you can choose whatever the like, even if we consider the case of parents, right? I'm blaming them. Like, I'm arguing that yes, parents need to be blamed and held accountable and responsible and so on and so forth. But what if the parents only had a limited number of choices, right? What if they had a kid thinking that okay, we're going to have these many choices, but when they did approach those choices thinking them to be the choices that they thought they were, it turned out that those choices were actually faulty. Like, they were false advertisements of something that didn't exist. Like, you go to the school thinking, okay, yeah, hamara bacha will be, they'll study and they'll ask questions and they'll be like, they'll become the next Einstein or blah 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 and so on and so forth. They'll develop an interest in science or in arts. They'll become a philosopher. But at the end of the day, a lot of schools, even a lot of schools promise this, especially so yeah. So I just give you a very demonstrative example of this. Whenever there would be an inspection in my school, or like a parent teacher association meeting, they would clean out the entire school. During inspections, they'd make it a point to paint the entire school. So it's like you're painting the school so that it passes the inspection checks. And it when there's a parent teacher association meeting that it passes, it is sort of appeases the parents. But on any off day, the behavior of the teachers and of the administrators would be completely different than you would see on a day where it's just a normal day, and people would not behave like that. It'd be very polished and it would be very performative. So in that sense, it's like I'm saying that I'm not centering out any one system. I'm not sort of saying that okay, it's the school's fault or it's the parents' fault. It's like a collective fault of society, which is that it disregards sincerity to a great extent. It disregards individual agency and says people to develop an agency. Because like, for instance, why would they need to polish up and perform on the day that there's an inspection, right? You're saying that okay, when generally not, you're trying to sort of advertise something that doesn't exist. And so you're sort of overriding your own personal agency. And isn't that like a really bad example for kids, that okay, usually we don't act this way, but today we're going to act this way because someone else is coming to audit us, and so you can get away with shitty behavior. So, like, aren't they undermining personal agency by themselves? So, argument being that society wants us to develop personal agency, but not only does it not give us the tools to develop personal agency, but at the same time, it discourages developing a sense of ownership and personal agency.
Um, yeah, there's a very nice quote. I don't remember who said it, but the quote is that the point of a system is what it does, right? Uh, so just just to your initial point, uh, you know, about society wanting us to develop a sense of agency. I'm not sure how much I agree with that. In that, I think a lot of these systems are built with the objective of sort of making you a very good cog. So, uh, in that, I don't think it's a systemic failure because I think the system is working or doing what it's supposed to do. Um, and which is where I guess, which is why I bring it to a moral failing in people who work within these systems and to regulate these systems. In that, if you do not care about whether the system is working, you will only look to check the boxes that require or require that are required to be checked, right? So the person, yes, when the school is being inspected, the school does all of these things to sort of impress the inspectors. But I would also question how sincere the inspector is in their inspection of the school. Uh, and the reason I refrain again from calling things systemic problems, even though I agree with your characterization of the problem almost entirely. Uh, Again, I also sort of do not like the word blame, in that I think there are a lot of uh, other factors that sort of cause parental failure as well. Um, so there's this sort of balance between accountability and um, sort of. I don't think you should feel ashamed for your failures, because I think shame begets more failure, right? It sort of doesn't allow you to address the problem. That's why I refrain from the word blame, uh, because it sort of brings in an element of shame. Um, but yeah, so what were we talking about again in terms of um,
More.
yeah, could you just refresh my memory?
Yeah. So you were saying that you don't agree with the characterization of the problem as a systemic failure. You're saying it's a moral failure on
Yeah,
someone's part.
on all of our parts, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah,
everyone sort of contributes in some way or the other to the problem.
yeah. Exactly. So,
So
yeah, yeah. So I'd just
again,
like to introduce a point. I'd just like to introduce one point.
and I think
Yeah.
just one
Yeah.
last thing.
Sure. Sure.
The other thing is, I think again approaching things systematically, while I think is very beneficial in finding solutions or identifying failure points. Uh, I think the problem is you then apply a solution. So, for instance, maybe a systematic failure that schools faced 50, 100 years ago was, a lack of standardization or a lack of standards being maintained across different schools, which is why inspections were started, which were a systemic solution to that. But that brought about a new problem, which is optimization, or optimizing the way you function to meet that outcome. So I think the trouble with incentivization in general is that you're attempting to manifest behaviors or a specific kind of behavior in people without considering maybe second or third order effects, which may not be immediately apparent,
Yes.
right? And more often than not, I think what you see is optimization for that specific incentive. So if I say provide tax breaks for my population having children, maybe my population then optimizes for having children but doesn't optimize for raising those children well, right? And then you have a whole set of other problems uh, that you suddenly don't know how to deal with, because you incentivize your population to do one thing, but doing that one thing had second order effects and third order, other effects that you didn't really anticipate.
Yes. Right. That is a wonderful point, and I'd like to add on to that point. To corroborate, well, not corroborate it. Partially, sort of, laterally corroborates in some senses. But here's the thing: standardization assumes that the cogs that you choose out of society will be completely separate from the social fabric, that they'll do the job that they're assigned to do. But that's rarely the case. Like, there are teachers who are chosen so that they'll be warm to kids, like particularly in the age brackets of like 5 to 10-year-old kids, right? Like first to fifth grade. And there are teachers who are chosen specifically because they sort of flaunt a very warm and nurturing personality, but they're not that way at all. But the system just assumes that just because they passed a test of certain sorts, that okay, they were like really charming during the interview, that we can absorb them, and it sort of disregards the social fabric in which the system itself is embedded. And so I think there's been like a sort of etymological disconnect between what I'm referring to as a system and what you're referring to as a system. I think you're referring to the set of rules that
Yeah,
system. I'm referring to the entire thing, the human beings that are included in the system,
yeah,
the social fabric that's embedded in the system. You know, everything
yeah,
combined together, I'm calling that the system.
yeah. No, that makes sense. But again, I think my discomfort with the word system again remains that uh, it separates itself from us, which is why I think maybe you could, maybe there's a better term for it. But I think there's a dangerous tendency to abstract problems, and I think the trouble with abstraction, while it's a very useful tool, is um, you know if I'm good at abstraction, I might become very good at building castles in the air, and I might become good at solving problems. But how well am I able to solve those problems when I meet them in person, right? So, for instance, I think a parallel I draw actually is what you call or what you term the systemic failure, which is these failures at multiple points or multiple levels that are happening. Um, could be called the universal sort of form of failure, and that failure is witnessed in many particular instantiations, but it doesn't have a general form. So I think calling it a systemic failure sort of um, obscures the universality of that failure, because it attributes this failure to specific categories within the system. Whereas there's not just a failure within these specific categories, which is, say, parents, children, schools, um, so on and so forth, but there's also failures in the way that these categories are relating with each other. Uh, so I think, for instance, this whole problem of agency, or the whole problem of us not being taught how to sort of think about these choices, boils down to a very fundamental question of a lack of dialogue, right? In that people are unwilling to talk about things that make them uncomfortable, very naturally, very understandably. But if you don't talk about it, uh, it's difficult for you to go about solving it,
Yeah.
right? I'm not saying it's possible. Maybe you do figure out a way to do it, but and again, I'm not even saying talking is a solution. I think talking is just a symptom of you acknowledging the problem. I think there are various instances where talking is also not a solution, because talking becomes an end in itself. So um, I think talking is a symptom of the fact that you acknowledge the problem, and I think to that extent, talking can be, or dialogue can be, useful. Um, so yeah, I think basically there is no. The reason I refrain from using the word systemic once again is just the fact that I think the word itself in us brings about a desire to solve, or brings about a desire to fix, whereas I think to a great extent the problem is contemplative, in that I don't think any of us, or enough of us, I certainly know this to be true for myself, sit and think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, right? And um, that's an attitude problem to a great extent. Of course, it's a material problem in that many of us don't have the resources to even have the time and sit and think about these things. Um, which is where I guess I would agree that there are failure points, and that the government is failing a lot of people. We are failing people that we meet maybe on a day-to-day basis. Uh, but I think it is useful to think of it as a systemic problem as long as you're able to identify and recognize particular instantiations of that systemic problem. If you treat it as entirely abstract, then all you do is create more and more policies to sort of fix these problems, which will, in my opinion, inevitably, sort of sprout newer problems that you can't anticipate.
So, okay, yeah. So I think, so I agree with a lot of things that you said right there. One of the things that I do disagree with is that abstraction can actually help you once you reach the general framework that you can use to describe the entire thing, which in the problem that we've been discussing so far is the following. Any system that you create that does not allow its microscopic entities to self correct and only affects change at a mesoscopic level when enough number of microscopic entities, like a statistically significant number of microscopic entities, is fed up with the system. If it affects change only then it will definitely fail because it's not allowing for self correction. And the reason I said, so you said a point about, abstraction not letting you able to give you a general framework. I think it can give you a general framework, which is the following. If you design a system that allows people to self correct, that allows people to own up to their actions in a way that they can reap the benefits of what they sow as well, as much they would be, as much as, all right, I'll rephrase that. They can reap the benefits of what they sow as opposed to being dictated by someone else that you should do this and hence you'll get that, or you should do this and hence you'll get that. It's like the problem that I have identified in the system, and when I refer to a system, it's not just one system, it's most of human civilization in its current form, like the contemporary mode of functioning of human society. In the modern day age, time and age, right? um, and a lot of that stems from this thing where you're sort of telling people, okay, if you do this you get that, if you don't do this, like it's a carrot and stick thing. So it's like you're subjecting them to a system which might not be conspicuous, or which might not be very visible, but you are sort of telling them that, okay, I'll give you a carrot if you do this, and I'll beat you with a stick if you don't do this. So it's like the incentive and disincentivization of certain things becomes an emergent system in its own form. And when I say system, I'm referring to everything collectively. It's not just one particular thing. So, okay, there might be an etymological difference of opinion in what we're talking about, that I'm referring to the entire thing as a system. You're sort of looking at discrete parts of society and like you're trying to piece that together. And I think but I think fundamentally we agree on that it's not just one particular cog, it's the entire mechanism that
Yeah,
needs to take the blame.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah. I don't really have any disagreements per se with what you said. Um, but I do think in terms of I would draw a very slight distinction between, say, general frameworks and universal frameworks, and the meaning or the distinction that I'm drawing between the two is the fact that I would call a general framework purely transcendent, in that you are looking at, say, a class of objects, say ten objects that I'm looking at, and all of these objects have an underlying property which is common to all of them, right? Which is what I would call a general characteristic of these objects. So this becomes a purely transcendent category. Um, where the commonality I'm seeing is in many senses abstract, right? I've abstracted away these common elements from the objects that I'm seeing, and I've derived a general sort of understanding of this. Whereas I prefer universal explanations or understandings of things, which is what I would describe as transcendent and immanent, which is to say, the universal exists beyond the particulars and is not dependent on the particulars for its subsistence, but the particulars are instantiations of the universal every time that they exist, right? So there isn't a common denominator I'm trying to abstract from them. I am saying there is a common denominator inherent to them, which exists within them. Uh, and I think, one sec, I think, oh yeah. So, in terms of a general framework, what I was thinking of essentially is to contrast this as two moral systems, right? So, a utilitarian system of morality would tell you that you should weigh the benefits and the costs of your act, and if the net benefit outweighs the net cost, or depending on different interpretations of utilitarianism, you have different outcomes. But the fundamental idea is that you can measure sort of good versus bad outcomes, and generally, depending on certain interpretive tweaks of what is the correct measurement of these actions, you have an outcome that is good or bad. Um, but I think this works very well abstractly, but I don't think you have very messy applications of this in actuality. If you contrast this with, say, something like virtue ethics, which is, these are virtues that are generally good for us, and let us embody these virtues. I think that is what you would term a self-corrective mechanism, right? Where uh, in a situation where I am faced with a moral problem, I choose to respond with what the virtuous option would be. So, for instance, if I am faced with a situation where I must lie, uh, but I recognize that lying is generally bad, I will choose not to lie, or I will choose to be honest, which is virtuous. And furthermore, if I'm in a situation where lying would be the virtuous thing to do, that is also a situation that I can adapt to, or I can sort of understand, provided an adequate understanding of what these virtues are. So, yeah, I think that's just what I wanted to add to what you were saying. In that, I think there needs to be this distinction between general and universal, and what you refer to as these self-correcting systems, or systems that allow for these self-correcting measures, are what I would say are maybe quote unquote universal solutions, in that they are not general, they are decidedly not central,
Yeah.
they're not top down,
Yeah.
but they sort of build capacity for you to solve the problem at your level.
Yeah. 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 So that, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I meant. Like, they're universal in the sense that they don't rely on a script to solve problems. They're self-correcting in the
Yeah,
that yeah they're self-correcting in the sense that, okay, we're faced with problem A, let's figure out something to solve it. Okay, now at some future point in time, now we're faced with problem B, so let's figure out a different way to solve it which fits it the best. So it's self-correcting
yeah,
in the sense that
yeah,
it sort of, okay, it might be drawing from past experiences, but it's not imposing past
yeah,
experiences solutions on the current problem. Like,
yeah.
it's coming up with new
And
solutions every time.
I think that's just yeah, and I think that's where I was trying to bring out the importance of intentionality, right? Uh, because only if I'm intentionally or attentively trying to solve a problem, am I likely to pay attention to the details or the unique details that that particular problem brings with it. Um, if I'm inattentive, or if I'm not trying to solve a problem intentionally, I then try to pattern match it with past problems I might have solved and try to impose a specific solution on it. And which is where I say there are these personal failings that happen across the systems, um, because of the fact that each of us is failing to be attentive or aware or intentional at specific or critical junctures.
So, okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a really important point that you've brought up. So now I think we actually do digress. It's not just an etymological disconnect as of now. Um, what I'm calling a systems failure is the systems failure to enable that particular, well, to disable that personal failing
Yeah,
I'm referring to, in the sense that that personal failing probably popped up because the system somewhere messed up. And the system, by the way, includes both the personal failure, like maybe like your grandparents generation. In that generation, someone screwed up, and because of that particular person's mistake, the system is now screwed up. And now, because the system is screwed up, not only are we screwing up, but also because of our own screw ups, the next generation is also going to. So it's like a cascade, zigzag cascade effect. That personal failures enable systemic failures, which enable personal failures, and it goes on and on and on. So when I say systemic failure,
Yeah,
it's like this entire sort of um, cascade thing, right? It's not just the system, or it's not just the people. It's both of them combined together. Like it's kind of like that thing where you can't separate people's social responsibility
yeah,
from the system's responsibility. Both of them sort of exist together.
yeah,
Both of
yeah,
them need to be blamed.
yeah. I think I think the last half an hour or so of this discussion has uh, very clearly shown the limitations of language and communication. In that, uh, I think we've both been sort of more or less saying the same thing, especially because I do agree very fundamentally with your point that, or when I emphasize personal responsibility, it's again because I'm uncomfortable with the word system, right? Where I think the word system tends to abstract the personal elements of a system away from like the nature of that system, which is why I bring the personal up over and over. But I think your usage of the word system sort of does acknowledge the fact that there is this tension between personal and systemic at all points, and I think that is precisely the case, right? Krishnamurti has a very nice quote on this where he says, "We wish to change society without." Or we wish to rebel against society without rebelling against the inner structures that produce this society. And I think that is sort of the tension I am paying most attention to, in that, yes, systems are failing, um, but these systems are not separate from us. And I think this non-separability, or you know aspect of things exists mostly in the world around us, right? Because when we apprehend the world, we apprehend it as unified. We see it as one. And then it is in the past that we sort of categorize and split and analyze them into discrete categories. Uh, but it's apprehended as a unity, and the way things are lived is lived in a unity. Um, so yeah, I think sort of understanding the relational failures that are happening um, would be quite fruitful, both to individuals and to systems, to sort of understand where these failure points happen.
Yeah, no, that's really, yeah, definitely. So one of the things that what you just said got me thinking on is the following. I think people like to categorize things and break things down into discrete bunches so that they can hold people accountable in a discrete fashion. Because there's this thing that accountability usually comes with a lot of punishment because of the assumption that the person who is to be held accountable won't take accountability on their own of their own accord, that they need to be punished externally. And that's why people end up sort of dissecting society into different segments so that they can, you know, discreetly hold that unit responsible and point fingers at someone, right? And I think that comes from like this fundamental socialization, in which again it I think everything goes back to the carrot and stick thing, that like if you do this then you get that, if you don't do this I'll punish you. Like everything, for me, everything, at least for the in the context of this conversation, everything seems to converge there, that sort of incentivizes dissecting the society into multiple discrete parts and then pointing fingers, because nobody trusts the society to self-organize from a bottoms up, on a bottoms up sort of, in a bottoms up framework. It's like, no, we need to enforce it from the top down. Like we need to start pointing fingers from the top, sort of, the top of the chain of authority or organization, and then it'll trickle down. But the problem is the trickling down, you're expecting the trickling down to happen through a system that itself, you're trying to change a system by propagating something through the system, which probably will, that'll bring about more, like you said, the second order and the third order effects. So by the time it trickles down to the people that it needs to reach to, it'll probably, not work anyway. And that's not even the main point. The main point is that the carrot and stick thing doesn't really work, because like you said, it's society needs to be viewed as one emergent entity rather than separate, several dissected parts. So I think there's this thing that, okay, the in for example, in finance, the stock markets in China or the stock markets in the US will affect the stock market in Europe or in India, right? It's everything goes hand in hand. You can't just isolate it from the rest of the world, because everything is interconnected. And I think that's something that people tend to forget whilst trying to correct systems. They're only looking at specific segmental parts, and this is the thing that you'd said before. They try to look at like very discrete lumps of the system rather than looking at it as a whole. So instead of figuring out, using your terminology, instead of figuring out a universal framework to to enable the system to self-correct itself, they use like very specific niche frameworks which are outdated the moment you try to change the system, and it's no longer valid. And that's like there's a lot of non-linear uh, evolution that happens when you try to change the system. And as soon as you try to change the system, it just turns into something that you didn't expect it to be. And I don't think people take that into consideration.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, I think it's because there are maybe relationships that are not immediately apparent to us, right? Uh, and these relations between objects in our environment might become apparent to us only over a period of time. And on this question of time, I actually um, I think one of the reasons we have a tendency towards top-down organization uh, is because of the they're very effective at bringing about change if done successfully. And what I mean by change is maybe it doesn't necessarily change the internal constitution of my subjects, but it can produce very tangible external outcomes. So, for instance, I think China is very strict sort of top-down political structure has allowed them to coordinate and organize their economy across various sectors to sort of accelerate their economic growth to an extent that maybe emergent systems would definitely struggle to sort of achieve that level of coordination at that stage, right? And I think you can sort of think of this as a metaphor for the broader problem that we all face, which is that uh, in the larger scheme of things, our lifespans are really short, right? Um, and I think we what we might call wisdom is sort of a necessary byproduct of a lot of experience and a lot of reflection on that experience. And I think by the time we're ready to really grow up, um, in a sense where we recognize um, many of the shortcomings and the ways in which we can overcome those shortcomings, we're probably very old, right? So I think there's and sort of bringing this parallel from Lord of the Rings actually, because I think a big factor for why the elves, for instance, were again they were not they didn't make the best decisions at all times, but I think what Tolkien sort of, I don't know whether this was intentional or unintentional on his part, showed was that um, these sort of extremely long lifespans allow you to sort of accumulate a lot of experience and reflect on your experiences a lot, which does allow for sort of emergent, organic, uh, organic sort of means of coordination. In the absence of that, then the only way you can build these sustained systems is through very clean transmissions across generations, right? Um, and then it becomes a question of how well are you able to inculcate certain values in your children? How well are your schools inculcating certain values in your children? Um, and yeah, I think that's sort of the main question to sort of solve.
Mm.
I mean, again, I don't like the word solve because it posits it feels mechanical to me.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very active element or a very conscious element involved in everything that we do. Uh, and I think mechanistic descriptions sort of deprive deprive you of that richness. But yeah, I think yeah, that's sort of what I would say about that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Thank you for that. Because so I just came up, so I was trying to abstract out whatever you said at the very end there. And I think the fundamental sort of conflict or the dilemma that we have that we're stuck at is trying to trying to trying to order things in a way that we don't end up taming chaos, because we need the chaos in order to grow, right? We need to be disorderly in order to grow. We need to be able to have conflict. We need
Correct.
to shout at each other in order to grow. That's like like conflict is
Yeah.
the starting point of growth. Not just with other people, but with your own self, right?
Yeah.
With your sort of inner self. You're in constant conflict.
Yeah.
That needs to be there, like the permission to be in conflict. I think that's something that needs to exist for growth to happen, right? For growth to happen even more. And so the fundamental dilemma that I think we're faced with as a society is that we want to order things without taming the chaos, and we need enough chaos but without crippling the order, that order just disappears. So it's like we want to operate at that sweet spot between the two, but we don't know where that sweet spot is,
Yeah.
where we can order systems in a way that allows systems to be chaotic, but then allow systems to be chaotic in a way that it doesn't completely destroy the order.
And I think on the sweet spot that you mentioned, I think that sweet spot exists moment to moment, right? In that uh, you are at that sweet spot when you are aware, where you are receptive to the change that is happening around you, but you're ordering that change within you in terms of the way you respond to that change. And you introduce order to your environment when you act with that sense of awareness or intention. Uh, so I think the sweet spot is there. It just the sweet spot doesn't exist as an abstraction. The sweet spot exists as a momentary um, actuality.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the very important things that you'd said that I'd like to sort of recenter on is the thing you'd said, this really important thing about societal structures being a representation of our inner structures, the like of our inner psyche, sort of, right? So I think that's really important because there's been this entire, like, sort of since COVID, I think since the pandemic and the lockdowns, there's been this resurgence of an emphasis on mental health, but I don't think there's been enough emphasis on proper therapy, right? Like ethical therapy. I think a lot of structures actually sort of, sorry, I think I just rephrased that. Just give me a second to articulate this. A lot of structures exploit dysfunction within ourselves to maintain the structures themselves. Like a lot of, like you said, the point of the system is to do what it does, right? So I think a lot of systems thrive on dysfunction that we hold within ourselves. And I found that this to be valid in therapy itself. That therapy itself encourages dysfunction to a great extent. Like, for example, I'll just tell you this one example. And I was quite furious when I saw this. There was this like world famous psychologist who was on the Diary of a CEO podcast, and she said that uh, she rightly believes that a lot of women don't feel safe when the guy doesn't pay for their coffee, for their $5 coffee. And I'm like, okay. And she said that I usually validate this in when I'm in therapy. And I'm like, okay, that's a very strange word to use. You're saying that just because the man didn't pay for your coffee, you're saying that the woman has to be validated whilst feeling unsafe. Like, like, that's a very big thing, right? Like, safe and unsafe are words that we use in a very different context. Like, you fear for your safety, even your emotional safety. Like, if you fear for your emotional safety, but just because someone else didn't pay for your share of the bill, I don't think that counts as grounds to feel emotionally you know em, let alone physically unsafe. I don't think it even counts as grounds to feel emotionally unsafe. So, just taking that as an example, I think therapy and even human resources departments, to a great extent, they enable dysfunction instead of disabling dysfunction. And so, what you said really resonated with me, because this is something that I hold as a personal belief as well, that systems, on the larger scale, the zigzag cascade and everything combined, cannot be reformed unless we reform our own inner psyche and sort of become psychologically healthy and sort of leave behind or actively work to dismantle the dysfunctional tendencies that exist within each of us as individuals.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. And I think another sort of danger of therapy is the extent to which it can inform your identity, right? In that, I don't think it's beneficial for a patient. Like again, in terms of um, physical issues, I think it's quite useful for me to know what my diagnosis is. In that, this is the organ in your body that is failing. These are the things that we can do to fix it. Each of these solutions has these potential problems. Let's, you can sort of think about how you want to go about it. I think in the case of therapy, if I tell my again, I'm not a therapist, but let's assume I am. If I tell my patient that I am depressed, oh sorry, that they are depressed, I think that a produces a dangerous kind of validation of their own experience, and that it fixes or attributes to them a substance that is not a substance, it is a form, right? So your depressed self is your current form, and that form is not necessarily permanent or something that has to exist or something that is inherent to you. That is just the state in which you exist at this current moment. um, if I then attribute, and this is the whole, this becomes more of an epistemological problem, right? Because we try to understand substance, and substance going through changes in form, but substance being inherent, which is why we want to diagnose physically, say, a certain issue with my heart, because that is an issue with the substance of my heart. But to say that an individual is depressed is to ingress into the substance or the quality of their substance, and to say that they are depressed, which then means that that forms or informs their identity regardless of whether they want it to or not. In many instances, I think it just happens, and it becomes a self-reinforcing sort of feedback loop where my belief that I am depressed because I've been told that I am depressed makes me even more depressed. And that is even true for anxiety, right? Because I think it's one thing to be conscious of yourself and another thing to be aware of yourself. And I think anxiety is something that is produced out of an excessive consciousness of oneself. And if I tell myself, oh, I am anxious, I do not become aware of my anxiousness, but I become conscious of my anxiousness, which only makes me even more anxious. So I think the problem with therapists or psychiatrists or counselors sort of diagnosing patients and telling them their diagnosis, I'm not even saying diagnosis is bad, though I think there are myriad issues with diagnosis, which is a separate conversation on its own. But let's assume that diagnosis happens perfectly. Even if it does happen perfectly, I don't think it's useful for you to sort of tell your patient, that look, you have this, because I think more often than not, what it ends up inculcating is not awareness but consciousness, which then sort of ends up in this feedback loop where I am where my belief in the fact that I have this disorder perpetuates this disorder. And the reason here why belief does matter to a great extent is because, unlike with a heart disease, where if I have a heart problem, it does exist in my heart to a certain extent, and I'm not saying to an entire extent, because your depression often is influenced by very real extant factors, but it is also fed by my belief in the fact that it exists, and my belief in whether it's surmountable or insurmountable influences the degree to which it affects me. uh, so I think diagnosis, or giving a diagnosis to a patient, is quite harmful. And uh, the other issue I think that you also pointed out to is the fact that I think patients are often mollycoddled, right? Where therapy becomes a space to validate yourself rather than for you to challenge yourself and grow. Uh, so I think, like you said, therapy ideally, as a function, I think what it should be doing is give you a safe space for conflict, like you said, for conflict with yourself, for conflict with maybe the analyst, to a certain, I mean, again, within admittable bounds. But I think otherwise, the way it's practiced right now is often self-reinforcing, and I also do believe that is at least partly its function.
Right, right. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. So let me start with the first thing, the thing that you just addressed about mollycoddling patients in therapy, right? So one of the things that I don't like about that is the fact that it was the therapist who was affirming this belief. And it's not about valid, it's, I don't actually care if they validate or don't validate it. It's good to validate feelings, that's fine. But it's like the therapist is enabling that dysfunction by saying that I agree with this, that it's okay to feel emotionally unsafe when someone is not paying your bill. But I mean, it's a bit too far-fetched, right? Like, what? It's fine, okay, we can validate your feelings, we can do that all day long. There's nothing wrong with validating your feelings. The point is what you do after that. There's no problem with mollycoddling patients, but the point is, what is the belief system that the therapist is holding for the patient, that it's right to expect someone else to pay your bill just because you met them and you like spending time with them on a $5 coffee date? I think it's like you're feeding into entitlement, right? It's like you're enabling toxic behavior. And like you said, that it stops being about challenging yourself, right? So okay, and people will say, no, 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 how can you say that? And they usually sort of stick to the assumption that it's bad to challenge yourself, but maybe it needs to be done in a way that actually supports the patient. Maybe the therapist themselves, by the mode of either diagnosing them or giving them an identity to associate with, because most people who have mental health problems because they don't have a tangible identity that they can sort of palpate within their minds, right? It's not tangible for them, so they need someone else to tell them what to do or what to be or what's okay to be or what's not okay to be. And the therapist, instead of engaging with, okay, why do you feel emotionally unsafe, right? Why do you feel, uh, do you not feel competent in your own capabilities to to pay for your own $5 coffee? Is that what it is? Right. And so it's like, instead of asking all of these questions, it sort of becomes about virtue signaling in some sense or the other. Like, just the other day, I was attending therapy, which I'm done with. And the therapist is like left, right, and center passing judgment on me. Okay, no, you're sensitive. No, I can see the issue now. And I'm like, okay, are you there to judge me, or to like sit there and recognize my humanity? Because more often than not, it's about them affirming their own biases through this act of interpersonal interactions. So it's I mean, and this is not just one therapist. I've gone to tons of different therapists. And I think this problem is endemic, maybe, I mean, because most of these therapists have been Indian, right? And most of them have been female, by the way. Most of them have been, uh, you know, women. And I find this really odd thing that other women who go through, female friends of mine, women friends of mine, who have hysterical breakdowns, they go the longest time to therapy without ever being recommended to be on medicine. And when I display just the slightest bit of emotional anxiety or just the slightest hint of emotional hysteria, they try to push me on medication. Which so it's like they've internalized the dysfunctional view of the world, and are then trying to impose that on the people who are trying to escape from that dysfunctional world itself, and then they're calling themselves the gurus of emotional well-being. And I think that it's that thing that I really find almost viscerally offensive. That how could you call yourselves to, how could you place yourselves on this pedestal and be this shitty, this shitty a human being, right? So, and again, like going back to the diagnosis thing, it's like, it's a lot of the times I found people to be projecting a lot of their own insecurities, a lot of their own dysfunctions onto their patients. Like, for example, I met one therapist, and like everything was going fine until up until a point I said something that really triggered her. Like I told her that I can't seem to trust you. And that's a very valid concern, right? Like if you're a person who doesn't easily trust people, and that's the reason why you're going to therapy to work on your trust issues, and you're telling them that you don't trust them, and then they flip out, and then they're like, no, 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 but I've signed a confidentiality agreement with you, I won't tell anybody. And like, instead of meeting me with curiosity, oh, okay, what have I done, so let's work through this, right? So instead of meeting the person where the person is at, they try to impose their own worldview, right? So the question that I'm really trying to ask is, are therapists themselves free of the dysfunction that they claim to pull people out of? Yep, that they claim to want to pull people out of, right? So it's like they're claiming that, oh, okay, if you come to therapy, we can work on this, you'll be feeling great by the end of it, which has started sounding like woo woo to me, because it's not like a diploma from some top university. Like if you go to some really esteemed college, and you get this degree in psychology or psychotherapy or whatever it might be, that doesn't automatically mean that you're an empathetic individual who can sell their empathy on the market, right? So I think it's all of this, like the commercialization of pseudo empathy is what I'm really against. And again, it relates back to the diagnosis thing, because once you diagnose someone, it's very easy to push them on to medication, right? And I think a lot of people might be doing this. Like there was a lot of uproar. I don't know, and there was a lot of controversy about the uproar as well. There was this experiment called the Rosenhan experiment in the 70s, where there was this guy called Rosenhan. He was a psychologist at Stanford, and what he did, psychologist or psychiatrist, I don't remember. And what he did was, he did this experiment where he sent completely, like two or three completely normal and sane people to mental institutions, and they and he told them to observe what happens in the mental institutions, and the mental institutions absorbed them and tagged them as mental patients. And after that, when he made his findings public, he said that, okay, you know what, I'll send you a couple more people over the next few months, and let's see if you tag the sane ones as being mental patients. And then over the next few months, the mental institutions were like, yeah, okay, these are the guys that you sent to us, and these are the people who are, like, who are not mental patients. And Rosenhan said that, oh, congratulations, because I never sent you any patients after my first lot. So you've misdiagnosed actual mental patients as being not mental patients. So what exactly are you diagnosing here?
Yeah. Um. Yeah. There's a lot to respond to there. I guess I'll respond to it, what you said last. I think there is, yes, there is a tendency, and I think this exists in all disciplines, right? Um, where, and Whitehead has a nice term for this, which is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is to say that there is a tendency for us to impose our theoretical constructs onto the reality that we see, and to sort of prioritize these theoretical constructs over the actual lived reality that we experience. So I think when I come from the framework of a psychologist, I am then looking at every single thing that the patient does as a symptom, right? So uh, then the problem or the way in which I interact with the person changes basis the mindset with which I'm interacting with the person. So if I'm interacting with someone outside of therapy, maybe I have that switch off, right? So I'm not constantly pathologizing normal or absurd elements of behavior as anything more than slightly strange, right? But within the context of therapy, I might then start to pathologize quirks in people, and then I might arrive at a diagnosis. So, which is where I think the experiment that you just told me about really validates this, right? Because what, or the category of person that I was expecting, is what ended up determining whether I diagnosed them or not. Which is to say, when I expected a patient, I wound up diagnosing them with something because I was paying attention to certain things without my consciousness or without my awareness that I am sort of weighing these things in a certain way. And then when actual patients were sent, um, but I thought that they were the, the experimental sort of subjects that were sent. I decided not to diagnose them because I had those switches off, right? So I think that sort of, and I think fundamentally the issue then is an inadequate intuition that is being built in people, right? So I think a lot of problems that you face have intuitive solutions to them, and when you sort of try to analyze them with data with sort of very concrete mechanisms. So, in the instance of psychology, it might be symptoms. In the instance of economics, it might be economic data. Uh, in the instance of physics, it might be physical data, right? But when I prioritize symptoms,
Yeah.
that is signals of something happening, over my conscious awareness or my attention to that thing happening, uh, I will impose my theoretical construct of what those symptoms mean over the actual thing.
Yeah.
So I think this is also evident in psychology in that there's a turn towards symptomatic treatment, right? Which is to say, I am in therapy to solve my outbursts rather than to solve the cause for my outburst, right? Um, so I think a lot of this involves a degree of symptomatic treatment, and that inevitably, of course, never addresses the underlying problem.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a very important point, that there's this entire there's there's like a growing attitude among therapists to diagnose using symptoms rather than use the symptoms as um, arrows that would point toward, okay, what's causing this person to have these problems, and then solving the person's problems coming from a compassionate place rather than from a passionate need to fix that person, right? It's like you're trying to fix the person instead of trying to fix the internal belief system, or giving them a sort of compassionate relationship in which they can start to view themselves differently. So I think that's where it's like there's like it's almost a it's almost a narcissistic and grandeur, you know there's a lot of grandeur that, oh, okay, I'm a psychotherapist, so I can pass judgment on them. and they'll come to me with their problems, and they'll trust me with their personal lives. So that makes me feel good, because I as a therapist can get them to trust me with their personal lives, and I have influence over them. And I'm not saying all therapists are like this, but I would definitely argue and claim, not claim but argue, that a good proportion of therapists, especially in India, are like this. Because I just like to go along with the tagline that you can't sell empathy on a market, right? You can't sell empathy on a market, and that's what therapy is doing, at least in India. And so just the other day, I met this one girl in a reading in a book club, and she said that, and I think we were talking about some self help book. Someone was talking about some self help book, and she commented that, I'm not reading this book because my therapist couldn't change my behavior in the last 4 years. So what would a 150-page book do? And I'm like, okay, that's very interesting that you say that, because you're saying that the therapist, I mean, from what I got of it, it's either the therapist is trying to change you, or you're going to the therapist to change yourself, which which completely defeats the purpose of therapy, which is you go to a therapist in order to build a relationship that allows you to expand, that allows you to be more of yourself rather than to change yourself. But I don't think even therapists understand that, and they just, oh yeah, yeah, we're therapists. I've got a degree in this, so I that makes me capable. There's one other example that I'd like to give, that's very relevant here. Is that I'd met this one therapist, whom I'd met her on Hinge, and so she was a like a trauma informed psychotherapist or something of that sort. But she kept, like, all of her messages were about psychologically testing me. Like, she was using her knowledge of psychology to test if I'd be a good boyfriend. And I'm like, okay, I don't think you really understand what ethics are, and I don't think you should be practicing, like, you should be a practicing therapist. And she was a practicing therapist, by the way. That, okay, I'm like an empathetic trauma informed therapist, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's not how it works. Like, just because you've done a diploma in trauma informed therapy doesn't make you a trauma informed therapist. And so it's like there's this entire sort of credentialism thing that I think we referred to at the very beginning of, like, in the first 10 or 15 minutes, that just because you have this credential, it makes you capable of makes you competent in that particular field. And especially in a field like therapy, you just cannot say that. Coming back to one
Yeah.
point that you talked about, which was the tangible diagnosis, right? Like, if there's something wrong with your heart, it will show up on an MRI or an X-ray or something, right? But and it will be a reproducible thing. Like, if you do that same experiment, like you're trying to map out your lungs, or you're trying to map out your anatomy, you go to 10 different MRI machines, most of them would give very similar results, right? But if you go to 10 different therapists, all of them will tell you different things. And, like, so how are you saying that it's a scientifically accurate way of treating people? So I feel like that it's like an unintentional sort of fallacy on their part, that they're not admitting that they're not competent to therapize people, that to offer a therapeutic space. So I'll give just one last example before I hold the baton to you, hand the baton to you, which is this. If you come to me and I'm your therapist, and I have some prejudices against the demographic that you belong to. The most famous example I have is that of a male walking into, or the, let's flip it so that will, probably appeal to everyone. Let's say you have a woman walking into a male therapist's office, and the male therapist is misogynistic. Would he properly be able to offer a therapeutic space to the woman? Probably not, right? Because he holds biases against the demographic that the woman belongs to. And I feel like therapists in today's day and age are just not admitting that they have their own preconceived biases. And because they don't admit this, they usually deflect when called out in therapy. Oh, no, 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 you're just like, you're projecting. Like that. That's not the case. So everything just goes under this rug of therapy speak, in which they deflect all accountability. Right. So it's basically like they're not admitting their own humanity. They're not admitting that they're human beings who are imperfect and who have faults of their own, who are prejudiced, who have their own biases. Everyone has prejudices, but to claim that no, I can offer anyone a therapeutic space is just it's almost cruel.
Yeah, no, I guess I'll address what you said backwards.
Sure.
Uh, on the first thing that you said, and I think your experience has obviously been as a man going to women therapists. So in either context, though, I think the specific nature or the specific experiences that you describe with women therapists that you've had, um, I would also sort of argue, um, and again, this is not something that I've experienced myself. Um, so this is me sort of just uh, going off of certain ideas or notions I've had on this. Um, but I would say that because there has been a general tendency to um, there has been there's been increasing acknowledgement of negative aspects or negative outcomes of masculinity. And I think the problem that has happened over more recently is a lack of nuance or a lack of understanding of degrees of toxicity, so to speak. So I think what has ended up happening uh, is again, um, a misattribution where masculinity itself is conflated with its toxic forms, which then becomes a problematic expression of something, right? So masculine expression then becomes a bad thing because it has produced a lot of these terrible outcomes. But the fact remains that there are degrees or nuances to this, which is to say that there are elements of masculine behavior which are bad, which are decidedly bad, and there are elements of masculine behavior which can be good or constructive. And the problem that then happens is you sort of bifurcate your population into, or your male population or your female population into two bits, right? I'm talking from the male perspective because, like, I'm a dude. Um, uh, and the problem that happens then is you have one cohort which hates itself for its masculinity or is unable to fully integrate their masculinity within their identity. So it becomes sort of a part of their identity that they remain alienated from. You have another cohort which does embody your toxic masculinity ideals, which is entirely self-aware, self-unaware. All right. So you sort of unintentionally trivialize the discussion around the very real problems that this causes because the people that you need to reach are not people you're reaching, right? Instead,
Yeah.
to them, what you're communicating is everything that you do is bad. So there is no more any degree of separation between me refusing to pay for a date and me being a horrible person,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not even going to argue whether this is a good or a bad thing in terms of like whether you should be expected to pay. That's entirely separate, right? But my point then is essentially that because you've removed any kind of degrees of offense or degrees of severity, uh, you've sort of trivialized the very severe instantiations of toxicity which you want to solve for. So I think that is like one problem that's happening at a very small level. But I think this problem is also symptomatic of a broader problem, which is in terms of knowledge, right? Which is that we increasingly want mechanistic explanations for the things that we see around us. So, uh, the reason there's a preference for symptoms or a preference for understanding these symptoms and then applying them is because it offers me a very clean methodological sort of roadmap to diagnosis, which can be followed step by step and which can be replicated, right? Whereas the truth of the matter is, in fact, you mentioned, and in your second example, you said there are 10 different approaches to the same problem, each of those 10 didn't work. And I think that is actually a good thing, in that I think there exists a multitude of sort of psychological profiles that exist. And I think different ways of approaching the problem works for different people. So I think methodological pluralism is good, but I don't think it's something that the discipline actually wants, or any discipline actually wants. Uh, which is to say, I want a system or a method of problem solving that is systemic, replicable, and generalizable, right? So the way in which I diagnose then becomes mechanistic. The way in which I view myself is also mechanistic then, right? Because I then assume I'm an instrument for observation and not a human being in conversation. So, and that sort of changes the way in which I approach the conversation, the way in which I deal with the other person. And this causes this sort of fundamental relational breakdown between the analyst and the analyzed, right? So I think there the fundamental issue is increasingly we're viewing the world around us in mechanistic terms, which is to say, I view nature as a quantity, I view humans as a quantity, I view systems as a quantity, and essentially there has been an increasing quantification of the world around us, um, and an omission or an ignorance of the very relevant and qualitative aspects of our everyday experience, right? Uh, so yeah, that's basically what I had to say on that.
Great. So I think we should do another episode. Would you be in for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
That's
So
that's cool.
okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'll stop the recording now. Oh, by the way, don't close your laptop for a while because it will be uploading from the app. So it'll keep uploading after we stop recording, right? So
Okay.
yeah. So just make sure that it uploads completely when you close the app. So that this thing reverse side, what it does is it doesn't simultaneously, like, it doesn't capture your video on my end. It captures your video or your end and uploads it directly.
Yeah, I forgot it captures it remote.
Yeah, exactly. So just keep your laptop on
Yeah,
for a few, right? So that till the time it uploads, like it'll give you a progress bar with
yeah.
progress. Yeah, great. So when would you like to connect?
uh I'll have to let you know.
Sure.
I'm a bit busy the next few weekends.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, by the way, weekdays work for me.
Yeah.
That if that's an issue on your, if that's not like a constraint, if you're
Oh, weekdays I'm generally just,
sorry.
I prefer not to do weekdays because my mind is just
Sure.
tired.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. All right, so I'm gonna stop the recording.
Yeah.
Just let the laptop be on for a while.
Yeah, sure.
All right.